to be a neutral force looking to create negotiated settlements. Today it was announced that there'll be additional money, I think it's $500 million, for vetted elements of the Syrian opposition, for essential services and to counter terrorist threats, and $1 billion for a European reassurance initiative, for expanded presence, as I say, in East Europe, particularly in Ukraine. And that's on top of all kinds of other secret money. We shouldn't forget the $5 billion that was spent in the Ukraine in order to support any number of fascist and extreme right-wing organizations and for all manner of sort of social engineering. Now, whether it's in Africa carving up and dividing Sudan from South Sudan from Sudan, or the U.S. role in the breakup of Yugoslavia, where in any of the media here it was claimed this was all ancient ethnic hatred, that there were historic feuds and wars. And there was really a conscious creation by the U.S. and German imperialism at the time to fund a whole number of militias and groups for a pretty horrendous civil war that set Bosnian Muslim against Croatian, against Serbian population, all kinds of intelligence operations. Now, why am I raising this? We're talking about Iraq. Didn't I get the direction? But really, this is the policy of empire, and it's well understood, divide and conquer. It's a sophisticated use of anthropology at a university level, but it has a whole different role when it's applied as part of a military weapon. And it is often the co-opting of small groups. Now you could look at the British Empire and the way in which in Egypt, Christian Coptic against Muslim, in South Asia, Hindu against Muslim, in India, Pakistan, what actually led to the breakup of India, where 1 million died. You could look at the French role in Lebanon with Maronite Christian and Sunni and Shia and Orthodox, or French policy in North Africa in terms of Jewish against Muslim population. In Syria, Alawite against Sunni, Shia, Orthodox Christian. You could look at Belgian policy in Rwanda and Burundi, and earlier German policy of Hutu against Tutsi. In Vietnam and Laos, the use of the Montagnard people. I mean, we could look anywhere in the world, colonized world, and very consciously, always one group was used against another. And we know so well the ruling class in the U.S. has always operated through divide and conquer class rule, using again and again and again the most virulent forms of racism. Anti-immigrant bigotry, bigotry against LGBTQ people. This is really standard, but it's always important to go through the basics if we're going to talk about Iraq now, or any country where even the emails and the exchanges among any number of different organizations will so consciously take sides in Iraq today as if there is any kind of impartial role for the U.S. to play. Now, Iraq was a rich mosaic for hundreds of years of cooperation among all different religious groups, sects, and nationalities, Kurdish and Arab. Doesn't mean there was total equality and harmony, but Iraq was a secular society. It was never a sectarian society until actually the U.S. occupation. And it reached a height really in 2006. In 2003 was the U.S. occupation, where there was, after the shock and awe bombing, more than 200,000 U.S. and NATO troops rolled into Iraq and absolutely destroyed every single, disbanded every social agency That includes, of course, education and health care and infrastructure and roads, and the only ministry that was left standing was oil, petroleum. That was the only building that wasn't totally looted and destroyed. Every government employee was laid off. Every doctor, every teacher. If you were a member of the Ba'ath Party, you could never work again. The army, of course, disbanded. But by 2005, there was such a resistance movement on the part of the Iraqi people. There were more than 100 resistance actions a day. And in every way, the U.S. occupation was on the ropes. They could not go within a few hundred yards of a U.S. base without finding explosives, tanks and soldiers and so on. And they developed a very sophisticated counterinsurgency plan that employed death squads and torture and assassinations and massive ethnic cleansing. It was a deliberate policy of pitting one sect against another, really in order to change the whole description, but also the narrative of what was going on the ground, and to create confusion very consciously and deliberately as to what was going on. That was their strategy, and it was quite a sophisticated strategy to really a resistance, a guerrilla war that took on enormous momentum. It really was launched with what was called the bombing of the Golden Dome Mosque, which was a famous Shia mosque, the Al-Askari Mosque, in February of 2006. And the destruction of this one mosque, which was one of the holiest sites of the Shia Islam, was immediately blamed on Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There were no injuries in that initial blast, although the dome itself collapsed. This really a tremendous work of art and history and religious feeling. But it was immediately followed within the next couple of days by bombings of more than 100 mosques and the killings of more than 1,000, both Sunni and Shia people. And of course, immediately both groups were told that the other was to blame. It led to a very savage, genocidal counterinsurgency operation. And the corporate media here, all the coverage on Iraq shifted into how the U.S. was trying to stop a bloody civil war between Sunni and Shia. Suddenly that was the purpose that troops were staying in Iraq. It was to stop this terrible civil war that had unfolded. Now, what happened when the Golden Dome Mosque was destroyed and there were these several days and then extending into weeks of destruction of mosques and religious sites throughout Iraq? All U.S. troops were suddenly ordered to their bases, completely pulled out of every position and station while the country went up in flames. So now, even in the lead up to this, it's important to know that from the first moment that the U.S. rolled into Iraq, they did something that had not been at all part of Iraq's existence before. Not only was the entire infrastructure of the country disbanded, but every single position, and this means from food ration to government positions to who could run for office to who could be in the cabinet to everything, was decided suddenly on the basis of what sect you were in. And there were 13 positions for this and 10 for that and 5 for this. At the same time, a whole intelligence apparatus was set up using mobile scanners that took everything from fingerprints, eye scan, retina scan, all personnel data of every single neighborhood. And when the struggle broke out, then the U.S. also used it as an excuse, the occupation forces, to divide communities and neighborhoods. They said with blast walls, with checkpoints, with massive relocation of During this time, there was also a huge amount of both mass arrests, of torture of prisoners. I think we've all seen the horrendous pictures. Suffocation by water and prolonged stress and beatings and confinement and sexual humiliation and sleep deprivation, and the list goes on and on. Now, it was really to change not only Iraq, but the polls done at that time, close to 80% of the population in the Arab world and throughout the Muslim world, well beyond the Arab world. There was a famous Zogby poll that said 80% of the people of the Muslim world considered the U.S. and Israel to be the biggest external threats to their security. At the time, less than 6% saw Iran as a threat. And so there was quite a discussion in the U.S. as to how to change that around, how to turn that, how to turn the perceptions of who was the enemy on itself. And this is why when we look at what's happening in Iraq today, we should see the consequences, because you won't see a map right now of Iraq without seeing where the population of Kurdish and where Sunni and where Shia, and mixed in together will be also the map of Iran, of Syria, of Lebanon. There's a very active discussion. The most outspoken a few years back was when he was in the Senate, now Vice President Biden, said the only solution for Iraq is to divide it into 3 pieces. And that should be the purpose of the occupation. Now, he wasn't alone. This was the think tank thinking of the time. And others would say, but it's impossible to divide Iraq, because within the same tribes in Iraq are both Sunni and Shia. That whole parts of Iraq are so mixed that in the city of Baghdad itself, there are 1 million Kurdish people. There's Sunni and Shia. How would you go about dividing? Only small parts of the country are exclusively one or the other. And also the experience of the war had led to a feeling that attempts to divide the population were really an imperialist plot, and that's true. At the time of the bombing of the Golden Dome, both Iraq and also Hezbollah and Lebanon and many others issued statements saying this is a U.S. plot. This is not a Sunni crime against the Shia people. That actually where the Golden Dome was, in Samarra, had been protected for hundreds of years by the local Sunni population. It was not actually in a Shia area, although it was a Shia holy site. So any further U.S. intervention will have even more disastrous consequences for the population as a whole, because the only thing that U.S. imperialism has to rely on is further division. That is both the way they think, the way they plan, the way the military is set up, and it is also past practice. Going back to the wars against the indigenous population right here. Now, I want to also look back, because ever since really the Iranian Revolution, more and more the Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the absolute monarchies of the Persian Gulf have been consciously employed to exacerbate religious and national differences in the entire region, and all with the approval of the U.S. The most extreme sectarian organizations are really set up and funded this way. Now, if we look back, really, though, the beginning of this policy toward Iraq, I don't mean, as I say, we could look at any part of the world. You could look at British rule and French rule and in Africa and throughout East Asia and U.S. right here. But in terms of Iraq, especially 35 years ago, it was the impact of the Iranian Revolution that changed history in the region. And it so changed history because Iran had been the bulwark of U.S. power in the Middle East. Huge oil-producing country, and impoverished by the oil because the funds for it were coming directly here. But ever since then, it's now 6 U.S. administrations, Republican and Democrat. There has been one effort after another to see if it wasn't possible to set back the Iranian Revolution and to use war in the region and huge deployments in the region in order to overturn the Iranian Revolution. And it has always meant exacerbating the religious and national differences between Iraq and Iran to destabilize the region. It's constant destabilization. Now, President Obama has promised that there be no boots on the ground when he announced just several days ago that there'd be 300 additional troops. There's already 1,500 troops there. He said he's sending advisors plus additional troops to guard what's still the largest U.S. embassy in the world. And he also announced he'd be prepared to take targeted, precise military action. There's 5,000 troops just across the border in Kuwait. There's 30,000 troops that are in the region. So they're certainly in a position to take immediate action. There's also been an announcement of bombing and its possibility in Syria. And it's really impossible to know, once bombing begins, exactly where it's falling and what's going on. But back to the Iranian Revolution, 1979, because the collapse of the U.S.-supported Pahlavi monarchy that had ruled Iran for 25 years, it was overthrown by a huge revolutionary upsurge. And the U.S. was absolutely powerless to prevent or reverse this. It shook the entire region, and it created a huge surge of anti-imperialist sentiment throughout the Muslim world. And it was at that time that the National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, really urged Iraq to take the opportunity to attack Iran and arranged huge billions of dollars in loans, new equipment, and so on. And Iraq at that time was really outside of Western imperialist control. It had been receiving, ever since it overthrew the British-installed monarchy in Iraq, had received extensive aid from the Soviet Union to build up a modern infrastructure, to build up a very advanced free health care program, free education program, and to use the oil of Iraq in order to pay for this. And it was a secular state. But they really took the bait from the U.S. that with loans, with equipment, they could attack Iran and retake a very important waterway that they felt historically was theirs and in the dividing up had been destroyed. Now, this wasn't a small war. It raged for 8 years between Iraq and Iran, and it led to the deaths of more than 1 million, primarily young people. But it really impoverished both countries. The war, in terms of the Iranian Revolution, as all wars do, it consolidated the far more conservative forces. It led to a decimation of Iranian leftists. It left Iraq completely in debt, $80 billion in debt. And during this whole time, the U.S. was secretly funding both sides. They were openly funding Iraq, and then through the Iran-Contra arms deals, they were funding Iran, all while calling for peace and saying this is really a terrible war and look at the huge, terrible consequences it's calling for, and acting like they're absolutely outside of it. And yet the war could not have been fought, would not have been fought, except for U.S. policy that drove it and that funded it and envenomed it. And during this time, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, he was pretty open. He said, what's the policy? I hope they both kill each other. Too bad they can't both lose. Those were the famous quotes that are still quoted today. Now, okay, I should wind up. Let me run through a lot of history here. Iraq came out of this war, as I say, $80 billion in debt. huge unpayable debt, and so much oil was suddenly being pumped from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia that there was a huge oil glut, and the price of oil fell through the floor when they demanded immediate repayment of all these loans that had gone to pay for the war. And at the same time, Kuwait was doing the Kuwaiti monarchy was doing what's called slant drilling and stealing huge amounts of Iraqi oil. Now, Iraq, thinking they had an inside track, a good relation with the U.S., after all, they'd carried out their bidding for 8 years of this war, there was an official meeting with U.S. Ambassador April Gillespie. Remember the famous Gillespie tape, where she said, well, it's up for you to decide. The U.S. has no position, which was really the go-ahead, the green light. And Iraq went into Kuwait to take back what they felt historically was theirs, and also to stop this slant drilling and to end a debt they couldn't possibly pay. And within less than 48 hours, the U.S. had rammed through the UN Security Council the most deadly sanctions. It went through like that. I mean, August 2nd, you think nothing is going on in the world, and suddenly there's sanctions, and within that week, a huge mobilization began of U.S. forces in the region, just a drumbeat for war. The war was really begun on Martin Luther King Day. We shouldn't forget the choice of that day of January 16th, 1991. For 42 days, it was just a relentless destruction, a bomb every 30 seconds. 90% of Iraq's power plants, its communication, the water system, sanitation, sewage, drainage, irrigation systems, water pumping, chlorine, everything that had to do actually with water, storage dams, hydroelectric power stations, all destroyed. Huge quantities of cluster bombs, napalm, radioactive and toxic DU dumped in huge amounts. And Iraq's agriculture, its food processing, its warehouses, its distribution system, its fertilizer, pesticides, destroyed. Hospitals were targeted, clinics, pharmaceutical industries. All the major cement plants were destroyed, along with oil refineries and pipelines and storage tanks. I mean, it was a huge destruction. They were all the blueprints that existed for it. And at the end of that war, President Bush Sr., that was George Bush Sr., called on the Kurdish and Shia population to rise up, said they would have support, and overthrow the Saddam Hussein government, and set up a no-fly zone. And it was at that time that a Kurdish autonomous region was created. It was really an effort at that point to divide Iraq, and yet the government was able to hold on. And there was a feeling that sanctions would do the work. And sanctions were far more deadly, killed 10 times as many people as the actual bombing. And during those years, we had really a heroic and historic record of challenging those sanctions, of going again and again to Iraq at a time when whole parts of the movement thought that sanctions were just great. There was a famous quote from Madeleine Albright that she thought the price of 500,000 children was worth it. That famous quote said on TV to Leslie Stahl was like a wake-up call. Nevertheless, the sanctions didn't succeed, and as country after country in 2003 refused to implement them anymore, and it was clear Iraq had survived, under Bush Jr. there became a whole new threat and raising of the war threat, that Iraq had terrible weapons of mass destruction, that they were just minutes from a launch. And I think we can all, many of us anyway, think back to those days where what was said again and again was certainty from the media. And after a shock and awe bombing, far worse than the 1991 bombing, there were 200,000 troops that rolled into Iraq, and as I said earlier, just destroyed every Iraqi organization, outlawed every political party, especially the secular Ba'ath Party, and allowed only organizations based on a religious or national basis to exist. That was the new rule, and we shouldn't forget it. That came under the U.S. It was never by any Iraqi legislation in the past, by any Iraqi government in the past. And every, as I say, every ID card, every checkpoint, every neighborhood was divided by sect. And every allocation of anything was decided by sect. And during this time, intelligence networks and thousands of secret operatives also carried out the crimes. There was a discussion in the U.S. It was called the Salvador option, and that was a massive setting up of death squads. And John Negroponte, who had carried out this policy in Central America, was actually sent to Iraq to do just that, and his right-hand guy was named Robert S. Ford, who went on to become the U.S. ambassador to Syria 2 months before really a very well-funded and brutal occupation, a war began there. And all of this was funded through Saudi and Kuwaiti monarchists. So I'm just going to end on that, because when we see all of this today about the role of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, it's also called ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is another term for Greater Syria. When we look at the secure bases in Turkey and Jordan, and we think back to what happened to the Golden Dome, it's all of this is really a process of inflicting sectarian war through the entire region. And also putting in place a government that is absolutely corrupt, the Maliki government, corrupt and repressive, and has earned the hatred of the population. That is the other part of it that has to be recognized and understood. I think more of this can come out in the discussion, but clearly the U.S. Feels that the Maliki government didn't carry out the role they were put in place to carry out, and was making secret deals with Iran, was actually normalizing relations with Iran and with Syria. That's not why Maliki was put in office, and so that was also funded all of this. And just to end on a note of saying it just is clearer than ever before that the only way forward, and the way for the anti-war movement here to understand, the way for the political movement and the workers' movement in the U.S. to understand this, is to know that this is imperialist policy in every war and in this war. In the generalized, whether we're talking about Yugoslavia or Syria or Iraq, any part of the world, or we're talking about the struggle here, that this is the way that capital, this is the way that imperialist policy is imposed around the world, and it is why the only solution is unity and solidarity. That's the only way forward, whether we're talking about Iran or we're talking about the class struggle right here in the U.S. There's no other alternative, and refusing to buy into all of the hate and taking sides. Even in Iraq today, there's some very good forces, some of whom are lined up on one side and some on the other. And it's so much more important to shape the whole movement to say, no, the U.S. is responsible for this. They've done it through one war after another, and the only solution is U.S. out of Iraq, out of Syria, out of the Middle East, out of Africa. And really, the only solution right here is to take on this ruling class right here that's responsible for these crimes. I think I've seen on television a long time, on Freedom Summer in 50 years. And it was so clear how it, along with changing history, it changed the lives of everyone who participated, made them different people, and that is what the struggle does. It changes dramatically your experience with everything else in life when there's resistance. And just to say also, we shouldn't forget another important freedom fighter of that period, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, which is a former H. Rap Brown. It is 50 years. But he is in prison now the past, I think it's more than 15 years, but in Supermax, 10 stories underground in Florence, Colorado, total isolation, and in horrendous pain with some very, very serious medical problem that are being untreated. His wife and Ramsey Clark were able to go visit, and I think we need to figure out in the coming immediate days how to do a national campaign on this. I'm confident we will. Good, good. So everyone here be prepared to petitions, messages, everything that we can, because that's an important, you know, U.S. imperialism never forgets those who fought either, and that's the score they want to set. But I want to go back to the point that Larry raised. History is not on their side. That is the truth of it. Now, they're in a desperate effort to rewrite history on Iraq. And that's what they're trying to do with all these articles, to make it seem like they ever were concerned about the unity of Iraq. I mean, it's beyond an outrageous lie, or that they're concerned now. Now, there's something else, and just to, Kazim asked a question as to where is this going. You know, we don't have a crystal ball in the struggle, just that we really don't. We do know several things, though, and this is what I just want to touch on. We know that U.S. imperialism is not going to let the Middle East go. It's a huge source of profit, and even when they've failed at each step, you know, capitalist institutions and the military corporations and the oil corporations make fabulous profits. But we do need to know that they have failed at each step with what their plan was. Now, their plans grow more and more ruthless, but they have been unable to carry out over decades any of the plans they had for the region. It's a fact that Iran did survive and has thrived and has helped other countries trying to resist imperialism in the region. It's not a socialist country by a long shot, and what is missing is a socialist perspective. Desperately missing, painfully missing. But imperialism has failed, and the masses, through their own experience, have learned certain basic facts that can't be ripped from them. The 1991 war, it is a fact that the sanctions finally collapsed, and Iraq was able to survive at huge loss of life. They said 1.5 million people died of preventable diseases. Right, typhoid and cholera and malnutrition, just, you know, in the worst ways, and especially the children and the sick and the old. But they didn't succeed, and that's important. And then in the 2003 war, it absolutely was a howling disaster for U.S. imperialism. In front of the whole world, a country that had no army left, not one missile that could stop the bombardment of shock and awe, nothing that could stop the tanks and the 200,000 troops that rolled in. And yet, it quickly did grow to a resistance of more than 100 and more acts a day. U.S. imperialism set up a parliament. They vetted absolutely every person who could run. They set up Maliki, completely corrupt collaborator. And that parliament and that official and his whole administration that they set up was to continue their rule after they left. And yet they couldn't get from that parliament a status of forces agreement. It's quite amazing. You wonder, gee, these are all collaborators. How is this possible? But the pressure from the masses was too great. And Maliki, who was absolutely their guy, ended up making also deals with Iran and doing all kinds of things that they didn't want him to do. That's the pressure from below. So we just have to keep in mind, when we say capitalism at a dead end, we really mean that they have absolutely nothing that they can offer. Now, in terms of Marxist economics, they can no longer buy back their huge surplus. It's just an enormous glut. But it also means in military and political terms that it is an empire in serious decline and decay. And that its impact here at home, you know, every time they do a poll on parts of the world, that in this country, and the population here is so robbed of history, geography, you know, each new threat, they will just saturate every form of social media, print media, TV, every talking head, not one line of difference. And one day it's talking about Syria, and the next day about Ukraine, and the next day about Iraq, and it doesn't matter where. Then they do a poll, and they find out 80%, 89% of the population is against any military action whatsoever. Now, that's important too, because it means not only in Iraq and in each of these countries are the masses of people really learning and deeply suspicious. Now here it's not yet resistance. We wish it were. But they failed in Syria. Now that doesn't mean that it won't continue trying. They have a horrible new agenda for Syria. But we need to recognize what was accomplished in the elections in Syria, that overwhelmingly people came together to assert their right to their own government. So I think we need to be aware of this and not kind of write it off, that U.S. empire is so strong that they will have their will anywhere. Because the fact is they're not getting it anywhere on the planet. That is true. There are all kinds of resistance, and it's why they want AFRICOM to get into every country in Africa, because they're facing all kinds of resistance. And we could look at Latin America. We should really look around the world and know that there is real resistance. There is a growing political consciousness. We shouldn't underrate it. And our contribution, I really do think, for this is to sometimes it's just holding a perspective, both in the movement here and internationally, that keeps targeting U.S. imperialism, and that also keeps expressing solidarity with every kind of resistance, and a solidarity with knowing how difficult the conditions are for any country resisting the U.S. Conditions are so difficult. The targeted assassination, drone strikes, I mean, we could go on and on, the ability to starve countries down. But nevertheless, there is resistance, and so standing with that resistance here, explaining it here, that's a political contribution. And I think we should be proud of our attempts to make it on every struggle. This week was an intense week. I mean, there was a Venezuela action and a Palestine action and a Syria, Honduras, right, along with the struggle here, along with this being Pride Weekend and Trans Justice Today. That's quite incredible when you think of just the forces in this room, but also around the country, who find ways to resist and also find ways to stand with, sometimes it's immigrant populations here, standing with their own country, understanding those issues, but also learning from each other. So let's know that this is a real perspective that we want to keep alive and help to build.
You should have mentioned that the Iraq demonstrations that our own party's been holding.
Yes.
One in Durham today.
Yes, this is so true. On Iraq, across the country, there are demonstrations taking place. In Durham, this is true, and I think Los Angeles is it tomorrow, and all across the country, it's sort of how to gear up the movement again to respond on Iraq. And we have to know that here. We have to know that the importance even of these unified statements and actions, and take them very very seriously, put everything we can into them. Thank you.